To reflect on this program today, we have invited Gideon and Merijn Ouderamse. They will both approach this topic from their own personal angle, so I won't introduce their presentations too much, but I might explain shortly why we have invited them. Merijn Ouderamse, who is a sociologist and publishes very frequently on contemporary notions of culture, of activism, and of politics. He has recently written an essay for The Helling, which we have, because it's published on the Creative Commons license now, we have republished on our websites in his article, basically suggested the idea of the Maint as a valuable topic for contemporary thought, for contemporary politics. Gideon, who is part of the, I've seen you described as an architect-activist collective. Would you agree with that?
I didn't define it myself like that, but some people said so.
Yeah. But in BAVO
it's free for interpretation.
Yeah. Consists of a duo of architects that publish quite a lot about art, about activism, about notions of politics. And one of the main concerns in their work has been well, in any case, what I found one of the main concerns of your work has been a sort of critique of old-fashioned notions of artistic autonomy. And instead, what BAVO in their writings emphasize is that an idea that you can place yourself somehow outside of structures that define you, and that you can there make a sort of that you find there a sort of paradise for making art, should be abandoned, and instead we should, as I've seen you explain on a YouTube video, we should instead creatively use the abuses of the neoliberal system, one could say. Mm-hmm. Well, and it's very interesting as well that in both Gideon's and BAVO's work, that notions of inclusivity and exclusivity often in their analysis seems to switch places. That projects that want to be all inclusive end up being in some sort of form exclusive as well.
It's very interesting that I know the concept of the commons quite well. It has been a long ongoing discussion internationally, and in the Netherlands it doesn't really exist any kind of discussion around the concept of the Maint. And when I was asked to write an article for the Helling, the Green Left magazine, I was actually ice skating the day after. I went to Breukelen there, and I went to the Vinkenveense Plassen to skate with my father, and we walked through this big piece of land which was called the Maint, and we passed by a swimming pool which was called the Maint. And it's very funny that if you go and look on the map or you Google the Maint, you will find loads of different kinds of locations in the Netherlands. And you will find that there is actually a long history of communal forms of ownership, which is a history that has been neglected so far in the Netherlands in political thought and in our day-to-day lives. And what's interesting about the Maint is that it's a sort of, it comes out actually of the medieval system where you don't really have a property title, but you have user rights and user duties as well. And you can really think of the Middle Ages where sort of a lord would give the local peasants some kind of rights to chop some wood or something, or to but they were never, these kind of things were never regulated through ownership titles. So this was something quite new, actually. So these forms of property are actually, we see the leftovers of these forms of property everywhere in the Netherlands. But there's not much thought given to these things. Well, internationally, the whole discussion of the commons can be traced back to Roman law, which made a distinction between different forms of property. And that was res privata, res publica, and res communis. And so you have like private, public, and communal property. And for the Romans, the communal property was something that could not be appropriated or they were non-exclusive in their forms of ownership. So like the use of a certain property by one would not necessarily exclude the use by another. And you think of, for example, going fishing on the sea or something like that, or even breathing air. That I'm breathing air doesn't mean that other people cannot breathe. So they had these kind of different ownership concepts. Of course, another very important reference for the whole idea of the commons comes from Karl Marx and Capital, where he talks about the enclosures of the commons as one of the very key elements in the birth of capitalism. So you had in the whole of England, you had communal lands of the farmers, and at a certain point they needed a lot of labor in the factories, in the textile mills, and they started enclosing the communal lands, forcing the peasants off the land. We've seen similar processes happening in the Netherlands, but in a much more gradual way. So in England it was a very brutal process, and here it went very slowly with Napoleon and later with the land swaps, and there was some forms of privatization and modernization. And I don't know, I use the word land swaps, but in Netherlands we use the term ruilverkaveling, the process whereby all sorts of farmers exchange small pieces of land to create this kind of bigger pieces we have now. And in that process, a lot of the communal land disappeared. So for a long time, the commons was something for historians or economists. It was really a term that specialists used, but it was not a term that was used widely in the political debate. And this started changing, let's say, at the end of the 90s. Different political thinkers started sort of reusing this idea of the commons. And this was especially, of course, related to the emergence of the internet and forms of shared ownership or collaborative forms of working on the internet. And the most well-known example of that is open source software, or a website like Wikipedia. One of the most well-known thinkers about the concept of the commons are, of course, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri. They just, I think 2 years ago, 1 year ago, they published the book Commonwealth, which has a very extensive analysis on the political use of the concept of the commons. And I was at a lecture of David Harvey some months ago here in Utrecht, and he distinguished two forms. He said it's very important to distinguish between two forms of the commons. One is the commons as a form of scarcity. So let's say if we talk about the biological commons, for example, clean air, or the amount of forests, or the sea, or all sorts of natural resources which cannot be appropriated, but which are nonetheless more and more depleted by economic processes around. So he said in this case of the commons as a form of scarcity, political activism takes the form of a kind of defensive position. So people say, like, we have to defend the commons against, let's say, companies that want to basically pollute the air, or want to empty the seas with big fishing trawlers, or these kind of things. On the other hand, we have an idea of the commons which is actually it's plenitude. It's like the idea, it's sort of infinite amount of reproduction. So we have the digital commons, or the commons as language or effect or culture. And here you see other kinds of political organizing and other kinds of activism which are much more around the demand that we should be able to share. These are the kind of protest movements that form around the commons. On the other hand, what you see now is that also within mainstream politics, the common is popping up as a key element of debate. And this is not so much in the Netherlands, but much more in England, where both New Labour and the Conservatives are promoting some form of an economy that is somehow more based on the commons than before. In the conservatives coined the term big society, and in the idea of the new labor, it's called blue labor. And both of these ideas are somehow based on the idea that the state is increasingly withdrawing from society and from the public domain, and we should have voluntary associations, cooperatives that fill this hole. So in the conservatives, this takes much more the form of like, basically neighborhood associations or even religious associations. And within with New Labour, it's a sort of kind of a nostalgic looking back at these kind of early forms of organization where you had basically socialist cooperatives, and the same kind of things that we saw here that formed the housing corporations or that created the kind of first insurances for workers, or all these kind of forms of collective organization they want to sort of reintroduce. What's of course is the key key problem, let's say, is that what is happening is that it's a form of cutting down on state expenditures and asking the people to actually sort of work more in their free time to fill up this gap. And I think we are seeing some similar things happening here, no? That we have the state really pushing back from, withdrawing from certain areas, and the idea that we should kind of, by free labor, self-organization, we should fill this hole. And I think this is a very normal, accepted form in the cultural sector, that the idea, well, there's no money, then we'll work for free, and we'll try to get by and maybe make some money here or there, but we'll just be more precarious. So I think then I arrive exactly at the point where we should be talking about what's going to happen, no? with the whole way that the cultural field, the field of the arts, is going to be restructured. Because I think it provides a very interesting opportunity for, let's say, artists, for cultural producers, to reaffirm control and ownership. It's often very much neglected. I've recently published a piece in a book about art education, and when I talk with a lot of artists about the kind of education they get, there is this very strong notion still that as an artist you are an individual, kind of the old Kantian ideal of the artist as a kind of lonely genius that produces somewhere outside of society a work that is basically the expression of his soul. Instead, and at the same time, we see a sort of a very competitive idea about how artists should work. No, there's a kind of a sort of star system, which you have also in LA. Like where most of the people actually work in a bar and they make coffee or something, and then a few people become really world-class actors and become stars, and the rest of them are continuously longing for that. And it seems that a similar kind of form of organization is going to happen now in the art world, where a few people are going to get paid and the rest of the people are going to, work part-time here and then work for free in the arts sector. So the question would be much more is like, how do we within the arts and the cultural world obtain the resources to organize ourselves, and to basically also obtain the skills to work cooperatively, because basically you are taught to promote yourself, to brand yourself, to put your name, your personal name on every project you are doing, and this is a bit like what the Germans call the Ich AG, no? The sort of being a freelance entrepreneur, that is a brand. Your ego becomes your brand. So I think the cuts in culture open the possibility of forms of cooperation, and I think very similar experiences were there in the 80s when a lot of people started. For example, Purdue, the literary space here in Amsterdam, was set up in the 80s by volunteers. Different magazines were set up. Lots of W139, of course, also came out of this kind of collaborative form of production. And I think it would be very interesting to think collectively about the preconditions for such a practice, it would open up the arts and culture to, I think, a much more diverse practice, whereas now you always have this kind of big Mondriaan or like Fonds BKVB that basically set guidelines of what art and culture should be like, but then there would be much more power from the bottom up to define art practice. So I think this project is very interesting, not so much because I would like to own this space, but much more because it poses this question, is like, how do you organize collectively? How do you create these kind of collaborative spaces and processes? And why have we never been taught to do this?
I did not prepare a whole lecture. Neither I had an already written a certain text lecture on the Mint as a project, or the concept the Mint. It raises some interesting questions about what autonomy is. Of course, in the current context in the cultural sector, we all know about the cutbacks from the government on the cultural sector. It's an most artists seems to retreat in the concept of autonomy. You know, in a moment that from the public government there's a sort of step towards culture and a sort of urge to manage culture sector and define what culture should do or should not do. Artists start to claim their own autonomy, but of course it's a sort of reflex to also hold fast to all the securities they had in the last years. I think autonomy, it's simply too easy to retreat to autonomy in this context, in the cutbacks on art today by the Dutch government, because autonomy in itself is a sort of relational concept. You cannot define autonomy, you know, outside society. Autonomy is a certain state of condition or a state of subjectivity that is always posed in a certain relation. So it's very paradoxical concept. You cannot simply say I am autonomous, because the moment you already speak it out, it is posed towards another. So that's why I think the Mint is quite interesting. The project here, trying to create an autonomous space, but of course not just somewhere on the moon or outside society. It is in a certain context, and also not only an urban context, but also a political context. Of course, when I read all the text on your website, it's pretty clear that it is a project that has something to do with the political climate today, that really had launched an attack on art. So this is one thing. It's more an introduction. The second thing why I thought the project The Mint is quite interesting is, of course, this idea of the common as a sort of third element between private and public. Normally, our political imagination is always defined in private, public. These are the two things that organize our actions and our behaviors. But the common is sort of, a new element that can help us to navigate in a different way in our society. Something that is common, that is something that we share with each other. So a subject, somebody who is, like we here sitting today, talking with each other, we have something in common. It's the project. This brought us here, but it can be also other things, but that's a common. That is something else than the things that Merijn talked about. Of course, it can relate to each other, but Hard and Negri use, of course, the common to define, in all times, the material things we share with each other. Gold in the ground or oil in the ground, this was something common. Of course, people try to privatize this common, or they try to manage it from a public point, but then Hard and Negri stress more the commons today which are immaterial. So this is our language, knowledge. If somebody would produce a lifestyle on his own, in his very autonomy, it would mean nothing, because it would not be recognized as as something that is common. So this is the context in which Harde Negri interprets the common. I think it's quite important within the context of this program to define the common also as a sort, the thing or the cause that brings people together. A community is based on the common. You cannot simply bring 2 people together or 3 people together and hope that they will form a strong community, or 2 people. When you marry with each other or start a relationship with each other, you need a common element. If not, it will be. I doubt whether it will be a strong relationship. But it was very hard to define for me, or to find a guarantee that in these statutes, in the huisreglement, to find a guarantee that this house, the moment you bought it all together with the mede-eigenaren, the co-owners, that it would be something that really can give a floor, or give a podium to the common. You always refer to the term consensus democracy, consensus democratie. So this is something opposed to the what I would call the coalition democracy, coalitiedemocratie. So the moment you have 50% of the votes plus 1, you can define what will happen in a certain project or in a certain decision process. Consensus democracy, on the other hand, wants to raise or come to a point that there is 100% consensus, eensgezindheid, so that all people, 100%.
Unanimity.
Sorry?
Unanimity.
Yeah, unanimity. On the decision. This is, of course, I can hardly believe that it will, or I think it will be a difficult thing to do. Better to talk about to use a deliberation model of democracy. This is the thing that, or the point in deliberation is that you agree that an individual, or yourself as an individual, can be wrong about your own ideas and presuppositions. For instance, in our current in the current model of democracy, which is representatieve democracy, representational democracy, the individual is seen as somebody who is holy, who is really master of his own ideas and convictions and his desires. But in the deliberational model, you would start from the point that you say that an individual can also be wrong about his own convictions, about his own desires, about his own interests. Because maybe I want something, but the concrete thing that is decided upon and that I want to vote for is something that is that contradicts my own desire, but I don't know it. So in the deliberation model, we can discuss about it, and we can, or I can become conscious of the fact that it is not something that is in my own interest. Maybe it's more important to think of space in terms of, in the sense of a virtual space. Why can you not find a virtual space that gives you the floor to do the same things than with this little house? The virtual space can be in virtual reality, internet, or maybe also in the imagination of us, or in time. So then maybe I can refer to Harde Negri, who say that the city for the multitude is what the factory was for the laborers. So in industrial times, so Harde Negri used the city as the space where the common goods are produced. where people find commons to interact with each other. When I would refer to a sort of an artist neighborhood or a neighborhood where there's a sort of new vibe in the city, the moment that it is recognized as the place to be where this new vibe comes up, it already, starts to melt down, and it's another neighborhood in the city that is the new neighborhood to be. So, and that when you or thinking about the use of Hagenekli of this city, I think it's hard to understand why you put so much stress on this little object, this small tiny space, to have a platform for the common.
Well, I think it's you cannot really define sort of essentially what the main is, because there's lots of different forms of the main. So like also when I have been at discussions before, and then you have in the Netherlands you had the Maint, the Mark, the Brink. You had forms of the Maint which are exclusive in the sense that it's managed by a group of people and you cannot become a member of it. It's not open. There are other forms which are completely open. So as soon as you start looking at it, you will have like 20, 30 varieties of Maint. And then there is also like a political aspect to it that, for example, Michael Hart says, for me, the Maint is something that is accessible, that is about self-organization, that is about common resources. I mean, that's what he makes of it. So I wouldn't think it's very interesting to start saying like, look, what is a true Maint and is this a true Maint? I don't think that. It's much more what do you want to do with the space, what kind of reflection you want to make. And I think you need to make the distinction between, let's say, the hardware of this space, just this building, and the software, the kind of process you envisage that would run such a space. And this is like the meetings you have, the kind of membership you have, the kind of the organization of the space. I think that is would be the most important outcome of this project, would be much more the software than the hardware.
This can be an imaginary space, that like this is an object, of course, it's like something concrete, but at the same time it's an imaginary space that people kind of like invest in, like you can do a lot of things with this space, and then you have all these projections on what you can do with this space, and this is something that people have in common if they come together. And yes, you have like maybe endless meetings where all these projections are kind of like shared, and maybe it turns into a fight, or maybe it's just like a conclusion that it needs to be super flexible in that sense that that all these different interests can kind of like fluidly come together. But I think like what Maintenaar will have in common is some kind of like wish for imaginary space that can be shared. That you can share the imagining of what you could do together when you have something in common.
Then it has to stay empty, doesn't it?
I think no. I think, well, maybe it needs to stay empty, but I think emptiness can also create lots of possibilities still, It can also change constantly. It's like there's lots of, it's not something that, so the emptier it may be, the better, because then like it's very flexible. But I don't know, it can also be completely full at the same time, like one day and the next day not. So but I think it's interesting to kind of like think about having an imaginary space together and that you can start creating something together, which is, and I think for me, like trying to create space together is something, for me it's like a very, at least in my experience, it relates directly, you directly become a political actor. You directly start to intervene in something, and I'm really interested in this in the moment when like something you want, that you're interested, you kind of like can put it in practice and are immediately confronted with the outcome of their intervention. So like you do something in a space, and then other people will immediately react to it, and then a negotiating starts.
Okay, so that is important. You're stressing like the virtual aspect of it, or the mental space that we can all see. It's very small, and that we will have no need to invest money in it. We can do it right now with a large group of people. But I think the essence is that it's a physical space. It is a reclaimed strategy for the entire city, for the entire nation. It's much more. So it's the negotiation about
just claim a right to use certain kind of spaces that are not being used and that are now the city has.
Because it's very simple. When there's a better real use for them, you can go again.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the strengths of this project is that, the ambition is to actually buy it and own it. Squats, empty office buildings, when something real pops up, you can go.
You referred back to the 80s. And then I wondered what kind of preconditions were there except high unemployment and a large amount of empty spaces? And then more specifically, what kind of preconditions did people set out? What you think might be fruitful to, reconsider?
Well, I mean, yeah, you of course have to consider that at that time a lot of people were on welfare, so they had amazing amounts of time to spend. And this is a key difference. I think that right now, there's far less people that are on welfare, and if you're on welfare, you're completely people. Basically, you have the UWV that is harassing you all the time to do kind of different job interviews, etc. So I think the notion that there is a lot less time freely available. In terms of preconditions, space is not a problem. I think time, people with, and basically funding is a big problem.
And what
And
about
this
a
is the
completely
same
different political climate?
Yeah.
Squatting became illegal seriously in the 80s. I was not squatting in the 80s, I'm not old enough for that, but it was different. And it's difficult to squat something and to keep it. Places like the Melkweg, Tivoli, Paradiso, they're all from 20 years ago. I have a studio in a big cultural squat in Rotterdam. It's very likely that in 6 months' time we will be evicted, and not because we're not important in the neighborhoods. There is not the same support for the mentality that you try to put forward here.
Yeah, I think you would have to organize that support, and I think this is one of the big problems of the kind of very selective notion of autonomy that has been dominant in the art scene, which is basically I withdraw myself from society, and I'm completely independent from society, and I don't have to organize continuously some kind of support, draagvlak, how you call it, for the kind of cultural production.
The problem I have is that the reason to buy this plot of land for this house is in fact not scripted yet enough. Maybe not in what you will do here, but in the urgency for it. Why should you buy this small house? Is it for instance to compensate for the loss of all other free spaces for artists in the city of Rotterdam? Is this a sort of compensation? Can artists who feel that they are or feel less freedom in Amsterdam, can they come here to re-find freedom or to exhibit in another way? So this is the difficulty I have with the idea of buying the house. Not to say that you should not buy a house, of course.
Yeah, no,
You can do it, and it can be something subversive, but I miss a bit, the urgency. Why should you do it? And of course, can later script and all the actions that will be done here. But
well, what for us is important that it touches upon an economy or a factor of the economy, namely the real estate, which has been the most kind of destructive kind of economic mechanism in the last decade. It is because of the speculation in real estate and the mortgages and all these flexible rate mortgages that things went wrong. And it's through the mechanism of real estate and through this house and the for sale signs that we would like to attract some other people that are at first interested also in the house and its location and its specifics. And a lot of people, it creates a very interesting dynamic, heterogene group of people that come together through the front door of an industry that we're all very familiar with. And through money you will come direct into something where these notions of communal sharing and use will be addressed. As a sort of ideal kind of almost personal utopia is that if you imagine a group of 15,000 people investing in this property, you have formed a new community which is almost like a village in a city, where I could imagine that every month these people invest 10 euros in buying up other property. So it will create a sort of village in a city, which from there on you could define all new functions for all these buildings that already exist. So it's almost a reboot of the city, of the system that we know.
You seem to, I think you're missing out the point that as soon as you have this building, you do not necessarily have a use of the building. You do not usually have people that have money to actually program something in the space or to make something out of the space. And I think for me, an art cooperative or a cultural cooperative at the moment would be, I would be more interested in a cooperative that would organize activities. Me, I'm involved in a series of spaces like the Tolhuistuin, the Vondelbunker, and I can in any of these spaces I can program things. I mean, for me the problem is not that the access to space. For me the problem is much more that whenever I ask someone to do a collaborative project, no one has any time. And then everybody gets stressed out, and then there's no funding to get other people involved. So I think this is the real problem in Amsterdam.
Well, as reacting as someone who has structurally too little time and sporadically too little money. But as these spaces that you mentioned, like Tolhuistuin, you pay rent. The Vondelbunker needs to pay rent, right? And a lot of stress on this, or let's just put it like this. The fact that you have to perform in some way or form in order to sustain this space influences what happens there. For instance, when you might be able to use space very cheaply in an anti-squat thing, but you have temporality to deal with, right? And this project is different to the extent that it permanently liberates space. You buy it once, afterwards upkeep, yes, that costs something, but with such a small pace, it's not the same as having to pay 500 euros rent every month a person, for instance, right? Which in some cultural offices you have to pay something like that. So you have to work all this time to be able to afford the space in order to just, and then you have to that's my experience, for instance, with the Vondelbunker. You know, I'm producing in so many different fields, partly because I have to generate money, that there's also stress, that part of the stress is also generated from there. And this idea, I mean, this space could just be suitable for in a sort of permanent manner that makes it different from other spaces in which you are.
What would happen then when you define this space not just as a space that is commonly organized, but as the space where you can find time, a sort of church for time? It has already a sort of pyramidal structure.
I like that. Yeah, I like that.
And then see what happens. People. So the moment that I come to Amsterdam, come to this place, I'm sure that people that are here have found time.